The auction room smelled of old wood and polish. An old man in a fedora raised his paddle. Another 50,000 for a house he'd never lived in. My hands trembled. It was my childhood home, sold to pay my stepfather's debts. I didn't recognize him until the third bid, when the light hit a cufflink engraved with a W, my grandfather's initial. "Grandpa?" I whispered. He ignored me, raised the bid again, and started a revenge I didn't know I was the center of. "My name is Lena Caro. At 28, I am a senior risk analyst for Ardent Crest Holdings, which means I spend 40 hours a week staring into the financial abyss of other companies, looking for the cracks before they swallow us whole." I was standing in the abyss now, but it wasn't on a spreadsheet. The place was Alder and Pike Auctioneers in Ashmere, a cavernous room that always felt like a church mourning the death of prosperity. It smelled of old wood, bitter lemon polish, and the damp wool of coats shedding the morning's drizzle. Dark wooden beams, heavy as judgment, crossed the ceiling, and the pale yellow lights in the sconces did nothing to fight the gray gloom pressing against the tall windows. Every sound was amplified and suffocated at the same time. The shuffle of paper, a dry cough from the front row, the steady rhythmic drone of the auctioneer, a voice sanitized of all emotion, and under it all, the sound of the gavel. Thwack, a pause, thwack. It wasn't just a sound, it was the heartbeat of the room, counting down the lives of the assets being liquidated. I was at the back, hidden by a pillar, clutching a manila folder. The edges of the folder were soft, almost furry from years of handling. The tab, marked 11 Sparrow Lane, was in my mother's tidy cursive. It was her old mortgage file, the one she kept long after it was paid off, a symbol of her independence. It was worthless now, just paper. My nails were digging crescents into the cover. "And now," the auctioneer said, his voice gliding, "we move to Lot 27, a probate resolution, lien settlement, property at 11 Sparrow Lane, Ashmere." The name hit the air and seemed to hang, suspended in the dusty light. 11. Sparrow Lane. The words felt like swallowing glass. That wasn't a property. It wasn't Lot 27. It was the attic that smelled of cedar and dried lavender. It was the third stair on the staircase that always creaked. It was the knot in the wood of the kitchen floor that looked like a running dog. It was the wall by the back door where my mother had marked my height in pencil, year after year, until I left for college. It was my home, and it was being sold on a rainy Tuesday to pay the debts of my stepfather, Richard. Richard, who had married my mother when I was 12. Richard, who had convinced her to refinance the house, her only real asset, to fund his consulting firm, a firm that evaporated 3 months after she died, leaving nothing but invoices. And the debt didn't just stop with him, it coiled, snake-like, around my own life. The foreclosure was being pushed, fast-tracked, really, by the creditor. That creditor was Ardent Crest Holdings, my employer, the company where Richard's new wife, Sloane Mercer, was chief operating officer. Sloane, my stepmother, my indirect boss, the woman who smiled at me in the elevator, all polished teeth and surgical precision, knowing she was the architect of this very moment. The air in the auction house felt toxic, thick with the irony. I analyzed risk, and I had missed the predator living in my own house, the one sleeping in my mother's bed. "We will open the bidding for 11 Sparrow Lane at 75,000, the auctioneer said, scanning the sparse crowd. Silence. 75 was low, even for a forced sale. This was good. Maybe it would be passed over. Maybe I could... What? I gripped the useless file. I had 40,000 in savings and a credit score that would get me laughed out of any bank. Do I have 75? A paddle in the front row, held by a man in a shiny suit, wobbled. 75, he said, bored. He looked like a developer, here to scalp the bones. 75, do I have 80? A pause, and then, from the row just 3 ahead of me, another paddle lifted. It didn't wobble. It rose with sharp, definitive purpose. 100,000, the auctioneer registered, his voice lifting in surprise. A $25,000 jump. That wasn't a bid. It was a statement. I focused on the bidder. He was an old man, or styled himself to be. He wore a dark fedora, pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He wore thin, black leather gloves, inappropriate for the mild chill of the room. He was sitting alone, perfectly still, his back rigid. He hadn't been there when I arrived. The developer in the shiny suit scowled. He'd come for a bargain, not a fight. 105, he snapped. The old man's paddle went up instantly, no hesitation. 125. A murmur went through the room. The heartbeat of the gavel had stopped. Now, all eyes were on the man in the fedora. This was personal. Who was he? An old neighbor? Someone with a memory of the house? He shifted slightly, adjusting his cuff. As he moved his arm, his jacket sleeve pulled back. The weak, buttery light from a wall sconce caught a glint of metal at his wrist. It was a cufflink, silver, octagonal, and heavy. Engraved in the center, in a severe Gothic script that I'd only seen on century-old stationery, was a single letter, W. My breath hitched. The folder slipped in my sweaty grip. No, it couldn't be. Due for Whitlow. Harlan Whitlow, my maternal grandfather, the investing legend, the titan of finance who lived in a glass tower in the city and hadn't spoken to my mother in 20 years, not since she'd married my father, a man he called a musician with no portfolio. He hadn't come to her funeral. He had never acknowledged my existence, except for a single, curt letter rejecting my college tuition application. He was a myth, a monster, a bank vault with a human name. And he was here. 130, the developer countered, his voice strained. He was at his limit. The old man didn't even wait for the auctioneer to acknowledge the bid. His paddle rose again. This time, he spoke. His voice cut through the stale air, a dry rustle of gravel and old money. 150. That was the voice from a single memory. When I was 8, at my mother's wedding to Richard, he had shown up unannounced, told her she was compounding her mistake, and left before the cake was cut. It was a voice that didn't ask. It commanded. The room went completely silent. 150,000. That was well over market. This wasn't a purchase. It was an annihilation. Rage, cold and sharp, sliced through my shock. How dare he? How dare this man, who wouldn't pay for her medicine, now show up to buy her house, to gloat, to tear it down? I took a step forward. My voice came out, cracked and loud. Stop. You can't. A hand clamped down on my arm. It wasn't a gesture. It was a vice. I flinched. Turning, David Finch, one of Ardent Crest's in-house lawyers, was standing beside me, Sloane's personal bulldog. His eyes were flat, his suit immaculate. He must have been waiting for me. Ms. Caro, he whispered, his voice a silken threat. Don't. That house, it's mine, I choked out, the lie tasting like ash. Finch smiled, a tiny, precise movement of his lips that didn't touch his eyes. It's collateral. Lena, the asset was finalized for liquidation by Ms. Mercer's department 3 weeks ago. You have no standing here. You are a guest. He tightened his grip, his fingers digging into my arm. You make a scene, and you're not just unemployed. You're trespassing. Do you understand? His words were a cage of legal steel. He was right. I was nothing. A risk analyst who hadn't seen the cliff edge. I froze, the humiliation burning my face. 150,000, the auctioneer called out, savoring the number. He looked at the developer. The man in the shiny suit threw his hands up and shook his head. He was done. Going once. The room held its breath. Going twice. I stared at the back of the fedora. I willed the old man to turn around, to look at me, to answer the single, screaming question in my head. Why? He didn't turn, but he lifted his paddle one last time. He didn't need to. The bid was his. It was a gesture of finality, a punctuation mark, as he raised it, his hand, covered in the supple black glove, adjusted its grip. His heavy gold signet ring, the one I'd seen in old Forbes profiles, tapped the wooden handle of the paddle. Click. It was a tiny sound, but in the vacuum of the room, it was as loud as a gunshot, the sound of a lock engaging. I suddenly understood. The hat, pulled low, the gloves, the slightly stooped posture, a deliberate affectation. Harlan Whitlow, even in his 70s, was famous for his rigid posture. It was a disguise. Harlan Whitlow didn't do public auctions. He bought cities from a penthouse office. He was here, in person, in this drab room in Ashmere, dressed like a stage villain, to buy a foreclosed bungalow. He was hiding, as if he felt the intensity of my stare. His head moved, a quarter turn, just enough for me to see the sharp line of his jaw and his eye, cold and blue as Arctic ice. He didn't look at me. He looked through me, past me, his gaze landing on David Finch, who still had his hand clamped on my arm. Harlan's eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. There was no recognition, no apology, no grandfatherly warmth. There was nothing but a cold, calculating fire. It was the look I used when I found a fatal flaw in a company's balance sheet. It was a look of pure predatory assessment. It wasn't a greeting, it was a signal. The plan was in motion. He turned back to the front, the brief moment over. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried out, his voice cracking with satisfaction. The gavel came down. Whack. The sound was final. Not a heartbeat, a flatline. My childhood home, the pencil marks on the wall, the creaking stair, the memory of my mother laughing in the kitchen, all of it just belonged to a stranger, a ghost who wore my family's initial. The room erupted in noise, chairs scraped, people talked, the spell was broken. David Finch released my arm, leaving 4 distinct points of pressure that were already starting to ache. He smoothed his suit jacket. "A smart move. Staying quiet, Ms. Caro," he said, that awful thin smile returning. "Sloane will appreciate your discretion." I didn't answer. I just watched as the old man in the fedora stood up. He didn't wait for the auctioneer's congratulations. He didn't go to the desk to sign the papers. An assistant I hadn't even noticed, a young woman in a severe black suit, materialized at his side, took the paddle from his gloved hand, and headed toward the clerk. Harlan Whitlow, my grandfather, walked to the side exit, pushed the bar, and disappeared into the rain, leaving me alone in the room that smelled of old wood and fresh betrayal, clutching a handful of paper that meant nothing at all. The rain that had threatened all morning finally broke as I pushed through the heavy oak doors of Alder and Pike. It was a cold, cleansing slap, washing the smell of lemon polish and old paper off my skin. David Finch was gone, presumably having texted Sloane the second the gavel fell. I pulled the collar of my coat tighter, but the chill was already inside me. It had been there for weeks. The gavel, whack, the sound echoed, a definitive end. But it was also a beginning. The image of Harlan Whitlow's cufflink, that silver W flashing in the weak light, was burned into my mind. He wasn't there for sentiment. He wasn't there to save me. He was there for the asset. My mother, Eleanor Whitlow Caro, died 8 years ago, when I was 20. It was a long, slow decline, a battle she fought with a quiet, stubborn dignity that I had inherited, and her husband, my stepfather Richard, had not. Richard was a man of grand gestures and shallow pockets. He was heartbroken at the funeral, his grief loud and theatrical. 6 months later, it was quiet, and he was having dinner with Sloane Mercer. Sloane was the antithesis of my mother. Where Mom was soft edges and warm colors, Sloane was polished steel and sharp angles. She was the COO of Ardent Crest Holdings, a position she had acquired with what I, as a risk analyst, could only describe as high-velocity, high-risk maneuvering. She didn't just climb the ladder, she vaporized it beneath her so no one else could follow. Richard, with his fading grief and desperation to maintain a lifestyle he hadn't earned, was an easy acquisition for her. They married a year after my mother's death, in a small, tasteful ceremony that was more merger than marriage. And just like that, the woman who ran my company was also the woman picking out new curtains for my childhood home. The Whitlow name, that was the real ghost in the room. Harlan Whitlow, my grandfather, the legend. He ran his investment empire from a penthouse that probably had its own weather system. He saw the world as a series of transactions. My mother's first marriage, to my father, was a poorly vetted merger. He cut her off. Her second, to Richard, was a bankruptcy filing disguised as a romance. He iced her out completely. When she got sick, I wrote to him a desperate 2-page letter. The response came 2 weeks later, not from him, but from the legal offices of Whitlow and Gray. It informed me that Mr. Whitlow extended no financial or personal relationship to my mother's chosen domestic entanglements. He didn't just disown her, he wrote her off as a bad debt. That's why I am Lena Caro. I kept my father's name. When I applied to Ardent Crest, I came in clean. Top of my class, 2 internships, a thesis on predictive modeling for high-risk securities. I was hired for my brain, not my bloodline. I never told anyone my mother was a Whitlow. I didn't want the privilege, the assumptions, or the questions. I just wanted to do the work. And I was good at the work. I was good at seeing patterns in the static, at finding the one loose thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire tapestry. I started pulling 6 weeks ago. It began as a professional query. Sloan, in her capacity as COO, was pushing a series of high-risk bridge loans to a new acquisition. The target company was opaque, registered offshore, and had no discernible assets. It was hemorrhaging money. As an analyst, it was my job to flag it. I tried to pull the core data from our Nexus warehouse. Access denied. I frowned. I had Tier 3 clearance. I should have been able to see anything short of the chairman's personal salary. I sent a query to IT. The response came back, not from IT, but from Sloan's executive assistant, a woman who moved with the silent efficiency of a drone. Good morning, Lena. This data is now classified due to extreme market sensitivity. Ms. Mercer has restricted access to her immediate team. Sloan didn't even have the courtesy to lie to me herself. Market sensitivity, that wasn't the smell of a secret deal. It was the smell of a cover-up. It was the smell of bleach. I found another way in. I'm a risk analyst, not a hacker, but I know our systems. I pulled the cached server manifests from the last automated backup, dated 3 days before Sloan locked the files. The data was there. The bridge loans, totaling over $30 million, were being funneled into a single shell corporation, Mapletide Investments. I ran the name. Mapletide was nothing. It had no employees, no product, no infrastructure. It was a digital mailbox in the Cayman Islands. And the payment schedule for these loans, the interest-only payments were astronomical, structured to be paid out weekly. It was aggressive, almost frantic. Then I cross-referenced the dates. The first major loan payment to Mapletide was due on October 15th. The final default notice on 11 Sparrow Lane was served on October 16th. The second Mapletide payment was due October 22nd. The house was rushed to the Alder & Pike auction block on October 23rd. My blood went cold. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a structure. Sloan's power at Ardent Crest wasn't just built on her competence. It was built on her relationship with the chairman, Marcus Thorne. They were close. Dinners, weekend strategy sessions. The whispers said she had leverage. Now, I was beginning to think it wasn't just leverage. It was a partnership. Mapletide was their private slush fund, and it was failing. They were using corporate funds to plug a hole. But they needed a scapegoat. They needed a reason for the erratic cash flow. Enter Richard, my stepfather. The fool. He'd been forcing my mother to sell off assets even before she died. For her treatments, Lena, he'd cried, the fake tears welling up. The insurance, it just doesn't cover these experimental options. I'd been 20, grieving, and I'd believed him. Now I knew. He was covering his own gambling debts. He'd bled her dry. The house was the last thing left. Sloane hadn't just encouraged him to default. She'd engineered it. She had Ardent Crest buy the debt, using it as a clean, legal mechanism to seize and liquidate the property. He sells the house to cover her tracks, and she uses company funds to manage the transaction. It was a closed loop of fraud, perfectly sanitized. But they got sloppy. Arrogance always makes you sloppy. Sloane needed to control the auction. She couldn't risk a third party winning the bid and actually looking at the title history. She needed to ensure an Ardent Crest subsidiary bought it clean. From my apartment, shivering in my damp coat, I logged into my personal workstation. I had tracked the remote logins to Alder & Pike's pre-registration system. Most were standard corporate portals, but one was different. A high-security, encrypted IP address. It had accessed the system 3 times, setting up the Ashmere Trust 27 that my grandfather had outbid. I ran that IP address against Ardent Crest's internal VPN logs. A match. It pinged, bright and damning on my screen. The static IP assigned to the executive suite on the 39th floor, the same IP that had authorized the wire transfers to Mapletide. Sloane hadn't just ordered the hit. She was driving the getaway car. I leaned back, the pieces clicking into place with the sickening finality of a coffin lid shutting. Richard was a pawn. Sloane was the queen, and my mother's home was the sacrifice. And then, Harlan. He knew. He must have. He hadn't shown up to the auction by chance. He had seen the same vulnerability I had. He saw the asset, the fraudulent lien, and he saw Sloane's fingerprints all over it. His appearance wasn't about family, it was about finance. Sloane had made a fatal error. She had put a distressed, high-value asset, linked to the Whitlow name, into public play. She had invited the shark into the water. My grandfather hadn't looked at me because, in that moment, I wasn't his granddaughter. I was an unknown variable in his equation. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out over the wet, gray streets of Ashmere. The lights of the Ardent Crest building dominated the skyline, even from here. I thought of the 39th floor. I thought of the Catalyst, the massive glass conference room that jutted out from the side of the building. Sloane loved that room. It was her stage. It was all glass, offering a 180-degree view of the city below. It was designed to signify transparency, a monument to corporate honesty. What a lie. It was a box of mirrors, reflecting only what they wanted to see. It was the place where every dirty decision, every backroom deal, was sanitized by the view and the expensive leather chairs. It was where they finalized the plan to sell my house. It was where they signed off on Mapletide. It was the place they felt most powerful, most untouchable, most safe. The auction was just the opening move. Sloane and Richard had taken my past. My grandfather had just seized the board. A cold, calm clarity settled over me. Grief was a fog. This was ice. I would not fight them in the courts. I would not fight them in the press. I would fight them in the Catalyst. I would take the very room they built to celebrate their power, and I would turn it into a cage. I would use the one thing I had that they didn't, the truth. I am Lena Caro. I'm a risk analyst, and I have just identified the single point of failure. I didn't go back to the office. I walked. I walked for an hour in the cold Ashmere drizzle, the whack of the gavel echoing in my head, a counter rhythm to the click of my own heels on the wet pavement. I ended up at my apartment, stripping off my damp coat, my mind a static storm of shock and adrenaline. As I dropped the coat on a chair, my fingers brushed something in the pocket. It wasn't my phone, it was paper. I pulled it out, a single, small envelope, heavy cardstock, cream-colored, no name. It hadn't been there this morning. My blood went cold. I thought back to the auction room, the crush of people as I was leaving, Finch's hand on my arm, the old man's assistant, the severe woman in the black suit. She had brushed past me, a flicker of movement I'd dismissed, a professional plant. I tore the envelope open. My hands were shaking. Inside, there was no letter, no note. Just a single photograph, printed on high-gloss paper. It was a macro shot, stark and clear, of the silver cufflink. The Gothic W was in sharp focus, the intricate engraving catching the light. Beneath the photo, printed in the same severe font, were 3 words. Check the escrow. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. It was the first step in an audit. I sat down at my workstation, the analyst in me shoving the grieving granddaughter aside. The shock crystallized into cold, sharp focus. I was no longer a victim. I was a variable. Check the escrow. Lot 27. The auction was public, which meant the closing documents, while private, had to be filed through a bonded third-party service in Ashmere. That was Legion Trust. I couldn't just demand the file. I had no standing. I looked at the photograph again, a digital print. If it was digital, it had metadata. I scanned the photo into my system and ran an EXIF data extraction. The file was clean, almost, GPS data scrubbed, camera data generic, but one field, buried deep in the file properties, was left. Software. The image had been opened, cropped, and resaved. The software license used to do it was registered not just to a user, but to a corporate owner. Whitlow and Gray. My grandfather's law firm. He hadn't just sent me a clue. He had countersigned it. He wanted me to find his digital fingerprint. This wasn't a rescue. This was a test. I now had a search parameter. I went to the Legion Trust public-facing portal. I didn't search for the property. I searched for all transactions filed by the law firm Whitlow and Gray in the last 24 hours. One result popped up. Escrow file E90427. Status, funded and closed. I clicked. The details were locked, but the summary page was visible. Seller, Ardent Crest Holdings, lien holder. Asset, 11 Sparrow Lane. Buyer, Ashmere Trust, 27. Ashmere Trust, 27. A name designed to be invisible. It was a special purpose vehicle, an SPV, a shell company created for the sole purpose of holding one asset. It was a classic firewall, a technique Harlan Whitlow had practically invented. This confirmed who. Now I needed to know why. An SPV has to be funded. You can't just create one, you have to park the cash. The $150,000 winning bid had to come from somewhere. This was my world. This is what I do. I trace the money. I moved from the escrow portal to the state's UCC filings and corporate registry. Ashmere Trust 27 had been incorporated 72 hours ago. Its sole managing partner was listed, Tara Singh, the severe woman from the auction. Her registered address was COO Whitlow and Gray. That was the legal line. Clean. Now for the financial one. I couldn't hack the trust's bank, but I could check its corresponding assets. I cross-referenced the trust's new tax ID with SEC disclosures for major capital movements. I was looking for a $150,000 disbursement. I found it, not as a loan, not as a transfer. It was a dividend payout, an unscheduled, one-time dividend from a fund so old and so private, most of the market thought it was defunct. The North Star Strategic Fund. I stopped breathing. The North Star Fund wasn't just a fund. It was the fund. It was Harlan's original seed capital, the one he'd used to build his entire empire. It was famously, stubbornly his. He was the sole shareholder. He had never taken a partner. He had just used the very heart of his fortune to buy a foreclosed bungalow. I leaned back, the hum of my server filling the silence. The pieces weren't just clicking into place. They were fusing. He hadn't shown up to save me. He hadn't shown up to protect my mother's memory. He was there because Sloan had made a mistake. She had put a distressed asset, one with the Whitlow name buried in its title history, into public play. She had, in her arrogance, tried to launder money, and she'd done it on his territory. Harlan Whitlow didn't want me to recognize him. He didn't want the emotional complication of a granddaughter. He wanted the analyst. He was testing my skills. He was forcing me to prove I was capable of seeing what he saw. Sloan hadn't just stolen a house. She had tried to run a con. and my grandfather had just intercepted the payload. With this new, cold clarity, I went back to my own research, back to Mapletide. I wasn't just looking for Sloane's fraud anymore. I was looking for the specific vulnerability Harlan knew she had. I widened my net. I wasn't just looking at Ardent Crest's internal servers. I was looking at their partners. I was looking at Alder and Pike, the auction house. If Sloane was rigging the auction, she couldn't leave it to chance. She'd have a contact. I searched the email logs, not just the official Ardent Crest archives, but the server-level transfer logs between our executive domain and Alder and Pike's. There, a recurring calendar invite, a weekly check-in between Sloane Mercer and a Charles Pike, one of the auction house partners. The titles were boring. Weekly review, status update. But one, dated the day before the auction, was different. It hadn't been sent to Sloane's corporate email. It had been sent to her personal account. A rookie mistake. He was sloppy. The meeting title was one word: Harvest. My skin crawled. Harvest. That's what they called it. Reaping the assets from the foreclosures. This wasn't just liquidation, it was sport. The meeting notes were attached, a simple, unprotected text file. Sloane, confirming our SPV is lead bidder. Floor is 75, ceiling 110. We'll clear the lien and wire the surplus to the designated account. The surplus, the designated account, Mapletide. I finally saw the whole picture. Sloane wasn't just trying to cover her tracks by seizing the house. She was laundering money through it. She would have her own shell company buy the house for a lowball $110,000, then have Ardent Crest, the creditor, sign off. The auction house would then wire the surplus from the sale, the difference between the low bid and the market value she'd set, straight into Mapletide. It was a perfect contained loop of fraud. Harlan hadn't just outbid her, he had blown up her entire escape plan. He had intercepted her payday. I understood the message of the cufflink. He wasn't going to storm Ardent Crest with his army of lawyers. He wasn't going to make a phone call and have Sloane fired. That was messy. That was emotional. That could be spun as a family feud. Harlan Whitlow was going to let the law do the work. He was going to build a case so clean, so sterile, that the SEC and the board would have no choice. Revenge must be clean. Let the legal system, not the family, swing the final gavel. He was opening the door, but he expected me to be the one to walk through it. I had the internal data. He had the external leverage. I spent the next 48 hours compiling my report, the Mapletide wire transfers, the VPN logs from the 39th floor, the Harvest email, the cross-reference to my stepfather's debts. I built a 30-page risk assessment, a masterpiece of cold, irrefutable logic. I had to follow protocol first. I had to prove the system was designed to fail. I logged into the Ardent Crest internal compliance portal, the Speak Up anonymous hotline. I attached the secure file. I wrote a simple, non-emotional summary. Urgent, risk assessment, identifying significant financial irregularities, potential wire fraud, and conflicts of interest linked to the Mapletide acquisition and COO Sloane Mercer, requesting immediate internal audit. I hit send. The system was anonymous, but I knew exactly who received those alerts. The Director of Internal Controls, a man Sloane had promoted just 3 months ago. I was feeding my evidence directly into her paper shredder, but I had to do it. It was a necessary step. I waited. The file was marked read at 4:02 p.m. The silence that followed was deafening. The entire 39th floor acted as if nothing had happened. Sloane even walked past my desk the next day, her heels clicking a sharp staccato on the marble. She paused, offering me that thin, polished smile. "Lena, working hard. I hope." I didn't look up from my screen. Always Sloane. This morning, the email finally arrived. From Ardent Crest Internal Controls. Subject: Urgent Risk Assessment. Dear Miss Caro, thank you for your submission. We have reviewed the data provided. The transactions related to the Mapletide acquisition and associated asset liquidations have been previously audited and found to be in full compliance with corporate policy. No further findings are warranted at this time. We appreciate your diligence. No findings. The words hung on my screen, a monument to their arrogance. The machine wasn't just rigged, it was bought and paid for. I closed the email. I looked at the backup file I'd saved on an encrypted, air-gapped drive. I looked at the invitation on my calendar for the quarterly review meeting. It was scheduled for tomorrow, in the Catalyst. They thought they had buried the evidence. They thought I would be silent. They didn't realize I wasn't asking for their permission. I was just giving them one last chance to confess. The official channels were dead. I needed a different stage. And Sloane, in her infinite hubris, had already built it for me. The 39th floor was silent at 8:53 a.m. The air up here is different, thinner, colder. It's the pressurized atmosphere of money and power, scrubbed clean of any human smell. The quarterly review wasn't scheduled until 9 o'clock, but I was never late. I walked past the main security turnstiles. My employee badge stayed deep in my coat pocket. The magnetic stripe was a liability. It was a digital log, a breadcrumb. Using it would be an amateur mistake. Instead, I used the generic visitor pass I'd requested from the front desk yesterday, citing a vendor consultation. The scanner beeped. The gate slid open. The log on the server wouldn't read Lena Caro. It would read Visitor 04B. 7 minutes. I walked into the Catalyst. The room was a monument to Sloane's arrogance. It was a massive glass box, jutting out from the side of the tower, suspended over the gray void of Ashmere. The long black marble table was so polished it looked like a strip of wet pavement. It reflected the heavy morning clouds. It was less a conference room and more an interrogation chamber with a view. I moved to the side credenza, the one with the auxiliary AV equipment. I pulled the device from my bag. It was a standard-issue Polycom training capture unit, small, black, and utterly unremarkable. I had requisitioned it 3 days ago. The IT ticket read, Required for Compliance Training Module 4.1, Archiving Executive Risk Assessments. It was approved in 4 minutes by an automated system. It was, by all definitions, a standard, authorized piece of corporate equipment. I plugged the unit into the network port and the HDMI splitter, a tiny green light, no bigger than a pinhead, winked on. The unit was active. It was now capturing high-definition video and audio of the entire room, and more importantly, it was streaming that feed to a secure IP address on the internal network. I took my seat at the table. My back was to the city, my face to the door. I booted my laptop, I placed my notebook on the marble, and then I laid the trap. It wasn't the encrypted thumb drive in my pocket, the one containing the real evidence. The trap was a stack of 5 beautifully bound paper reports. The title? Preliminary Risk Analysis, Mapletide Investments. It was a masterpiece of incompetence. I had spent 12 hours deliberately hamstringing the data. I used outdated Q2 models. I miscalculated the liquidity ratios. I flagged high-risk debt structures as suboptimal. I focused on the symptoms, the cash burn, the high interest, while meticulously avoiding the disease, the wire fraud, the conflict of interest, the IP address from the 39th floor. It was the report of an analyst who was smart, but not smart enough. It was bait, designed to trigger Sloane's defining characteristics, her arrogance, her hubris, and her obsessive need to prove she was the smartest person in the room. The door hissed open. David Finch, the company lawyer, entered first. He gave me a thin, reptilian smile, the same one he'd worn at the auction. He was the bulldog, and he thought he'd already won. 2 VPs followed, smelling of expensive coffee and low-level anxiety. They took their seats, avoiding my eyes. Then Sloane. She entered at 8:59 a.m. She was power, weaponized, a severe, knife-gray suit. Her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She radiated a cold, absolute control. She didn't look at me. She looked at the agenda on the main screen, as if I were just another item to be checked off. Lena, she said, her voice clipping the air. She didn't sit. Let's get this over with. As she settled, my fingers moved across my keyboard. I wasn't just launching my decoy presentation, I was opening a separate, secure window, the Ardent Comms internal messaging tool. I pasted the direct IP address from the training camera. I selected a distribution list. Governance and compliance, all staff, not the director, whom Sloan owned. I was targeting the 40 analysts, auditors, and paralegals under him, the people who did the real work. Subject: urgent. Live training module. Conflict of interest protocols. I didn't hit send. That would create an email, easily ignored. I used the Priority 1 alert function. It was a feature normally reserved for system-wide failure warnings or active shooter drills. It wasn't an email. It was a command. I set the delivery, 9:05 a.m. At that exact moment, the live feed would hijack the screen of every single compliance employee at their desk. As you'll see, I started, my voice even, the decoy slide appearing on the massive screen in front of us. The projections for the Mapletide acquisition show significant liquidity strain. Sloan let me get exactly 30 seconds in. This is remedial, Lena. She didn't even look at the screen. She picked up the paper copy, the bait, and flipped through it with pure contempt. Her lip curled. Your modeling is wrong. Q2 data is irrelevant. You've missed the entire structure. She looked at David Finch, a small, shared smile of superiority. Then she turned her gaze on me, her eyes glittering with the cold pleasure of the kill. She was going to correct me. She was going to teach me how stupid I was. You're flagging liquidity? She scoffed. That's not the issue. The funds aren't missing, she said, emphasizing the word I deliberately used in my summary. They are bridged. I kept my face impassive. I watched the clock on my laptop. 9:04 a.m. The structure is perfectly sound, Sloan continued, her voice condescending, lecturing. Mapletide is simply the designated SPV to hold the asset transfers during the escrow window. This structure allows us to bypass the standard 48-hour compliance review. It's a standard, sensitive procedure for an acquisition of this nature. Got her. She said it, bypasses the standard 48-hour compliance review, the exact mechanism of the fraud. The crime, described as a feature, the camera was capturing it all. The microphone was soaking up every self-assured syllable. The main door to the catalyst hissed open. Marcus Thorne, the chairman, strode in, his face slightly flushed. Sloan, sorry I'm late. Traffic was a nightmare. What did I miss? 9:05 a.m. As Thorne slid into his seat at the head of the table, the main screen flickered. It split. On the left side, my useless decoy slide on liquidity. On the right side, a new window. It was the live feed from the Polycom unit. It was a high-definition, crystal-clear close-up of Sloan Mercer's face. The audio, on a 1-second delay, kicked in, booming through the room's speakers. Bypasses the standard 48-hour compliance review. It's a standard, sensitive procedure for an acquisition. Sloan froze. Her mouth, which had been shaped in a condescending smile, snapped shut. Her color vanished. She went from predator to prey in a single heartbeat. She stared at her own face on the screen. David Finch jumped to his feet, his chair scraping violently. What is that? Turn it off. Who authorized this feed? Sloane's hand slammed down on the touch panel controls embedded in the marble. She jabbed at the screen-sharing icon. Nothing happened. I had already hit the presentation lock function on my own laptop. The system was now hard-keyed to my terminal. I did. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the panic. Everyone turned to me. It's a mandatory training session, as per my IT ticket, I said, my voice cold and steady. And I believe we have a problem. I nodded to my decoy slide on the left. We have a liquidity problem. Then I nodded to Sloane's terrified face, still frozen on the right. And we have an ethics problem. Turn it off, Lena, Sloane shrieked. The polish was gone. This was raw, cornered rage. This is inadmissible, Finch sputtered. His lawyerly composure shredded. He looked at Thorne, appealing. "This is a gross violation of privacy. This is restricted internal training material."
Exactly.
I looked him dead in the eye. The VPs were statues, trapped in the glass box with us. They were witnesses. "It is training material." "David," I said, my voice flat. "It's a perfect, real-world case study. Training on what not to do. Training on how our chief operating officer," I turned my gaze to Sloane, "personally instructs her team to bypass the very compliance protocols she wrote, the same protocols the internal audit used to clear her, finding no findings." Sloane was white. Finch was sputtering. The VPs were staring, their faces a mask of terror. Marcus Thorne, the chairman, hadn't moved. He was looking at me, his eyes dark. He hadn't said a word. Layer 1 of the trap was shut. Sloane had just confessed, live, to the entire compliance department. The auditors whose screens had just been hijacked were, at this very second, watching their boss admit to the crime they had been ordered to bury. The no findings report was now ashes. But this wasn't the end. This was just the opening move. This trapped Sloane. This implicated Finch. It didn't trap Thorne. I looked at the chairman, at his still, gray face. He was the one who had signed off on the whole thing. He was the final boss. I had sprung my part of the trap. Now I had to wait. My grandfather's plan was never this simple. He hadn't just bought the house to prove a point. He was holding a card. This was just the distraction. The real execution, the second layer, was still to come. I had just set the stage. The real star of the show was still waiting in the wings. The glass walls of the catalyst seemed to shrink, the air turning solid. Sloane was breathing hard, her mouth slightly open, staring at her own frozen, panicked face on the giant screen. David Finch was whispering frantically, hissing into the chairman's ear. The two VPs looked like they were trying to physically merge with their chairs, to become invisible. Marcus Thorne, the chairman, was the only one in the room who wasn't moving. He was utterly still. His gaze locked on me. It wasn't anger, it was appraisal. He was a man who had just seen an iceberg and was, in real time, calculating the velocity of the ship. "Ms. Caro," Thorne said, his voice dangerously calm, cutting through Finch's whispers. "You've made your point, a theatrical one." He was trying to frame this, to regain control, to paint me as an unhinged employee, a hysteric. "But you've also just broadcast proprietary, sensitive material across an unsecured channel." "It was a secure internal channel, Mr. Thorne," I countered, my voice as flat as his. "The same one internal audit used to send me their no findings report. I felt the compliance team, as a whole, deserved to see the discrepancy." "This is a setup," Finch finally yelled, his face slick with sweat. "This is actionable. This is—" Thorne raised one hand, a short, chopping motion. Finch went silent. The chairman was about to speak. He was about to shut this down. "Fire me. Call security. Bury me under a mountain of litigation." I saw the decision form in his eyes. And then, his private intercom buzzed, a sharp, three-note chime that cut through the tension. Everyone flinched except Thorne. He pressed the speaker button. "Yes, Angela." His assistant's voice, tinny and stressed. "Mr. Thorne, I am so sorry to interrupt, but there is a Mr. Gray from the firm Whitlow and Gray on line 1. He says it is non-negotiable." I felt the blood drain from my own face. Whitlow and Gray, Harlan's law firm. Sloane made a small sound, a high-pitched keen, and pressed a hand to her mouth. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He looked at Sloane's terror. Then he looked at me. His gaze was no longer appraising. It was, for the first time, uncertain. He hadn't seen the connection, not until this second. "He says," Angela continued, her voice trembling slightly, "that he represents the buyer of Ashmere Trust 27. He needs to speak with you immediately regarding undisclosed corporate bonds, sir." Undisclosed corporate bonds. That was it. That was the second layer. My camera trap was just the opening act. This was the main event. Thorne's face hardened. He knew, instinctively, that this conversation could not happen here, not in this glass box, with the VPs watching, and with my training camera still memorializing every second. He stood up. "This meeting is adjourned." He looked at the two VPs. "You're excused." They practically ran from the room. Thorne turned to us. His voice was dead. "Sloan, David, Lena, you're with me." He didn't wait. He strode out of the catalyst. Finch scrambled after him, grabbing his portfolio. Sloan staggered to her feet. Her mask of competence shattered, leaving only a pale, terrified woman. I unlocked the screen, killed the feed, grabbed my laptop, and followed. My heart was a cold, hard knot in my chest. The first part of the plan had worked. Now I was walking into the second, and I had no idea what it was. We didn't go to Thorne's office. We took the executive elevator down to the 12th floor. This was the working floor. No marble, no views. Just gray carpet and the smell of stale coffee and pressurized air. He led us to conference room 12C, a windowless box. The light was a flat, cold fluorescent glare. He shut the door. The sound of the latch engaging was brutally loud. "What is this, Sloan?" Thorne demanded, his voice a low growl. "What are undisclosed bonds?" "Marcus, Sloan began, wringing her hands. "It was a bridging, just a temporary measure." "Be quiet," Thorne snapped. He looked at me. "And you're the Whitlow girl, aren't you? That's what this is. You brought your family into this." Before I could answer, before I could say I hadn't spoken to my grandfather in a decade, the door opened. A different assistant, one I didn't recognize, held it open. The man from the auction walked in. He was exactly as I'd seen him, the dark fedora, pulled low, the thin black leather gloves. He was holding a slim black leather portfolio. He still didn't look at me. I was invisible, a ghost. I was just part of the room's fixtures. I slid my hand into my coat pocket. My thumb found the audio recorder app on my phone. I pressed it. The screen stayed dark, but the microphone was live. The old man walked to the table. Thorne, Finch, and Sloan were on one side. I was alone on the other. He stood at the head. He placed the portfolio on the table. He opened it. He didn't look at anyone. He took out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table to Thorne. Thorne looked down. From my angle, I could see it. It wasn't a letter. It was a list of CUSIP numbers, issuance dates, and principal amounts. At the top, a heading, Mapletide Investments, LLC, Private Placement Memorandum, Series A. Sloane's breath hitched. She looked at the paper as if it were a snake. "That list," the man in the fedora said, his voice the same dry rustle of gravel, "represents $32 million in undisclosed, off-balance sheet debt, issued by your shell corporation. Debt that is not registered with the SEC and is not noted in any of your public filings." He looked up, not at Thorne, but at the white, fluorescent light above his head. "I have the inside proof. I have the wire confirmations from Ardent Crest's primary account to the funding bank for Mapletide. I have the original placement memo, which Ms. Mercer here," he didn't even look at her, "circulated to a single, unaccredited investor before pulling it." He finally lowered his gaze, his eyes still hidden by the shadow of his hat. He looked at Marcus Thorne. "If this company does not make a full public disclosure of this material liability by close of business today, I will—" There was a long, terrible silence. The hum of the building's ventilation system was the only sound. Thorne, to his credit, was a fighter. He had been blindsided, but he wasn't broken. He leaned back, attempting a sneer. It almost worked. "You've gone to a lot of trouble. You bought a foreclosed house. You've dug up some paperwork that, I'm sure, David here," he gestured to Finch, "could argue is either proprietary or entirely fabricated. You've made a threat, but you're no one. You're a name on an LLC. So, before I have you removed for corporate espionage, who are you?" The question hung in the cold, dead air. The old man was perfectly still. Then, with a movement so slow it was theatrical, he reached up with his gloved left hand and took the brim of his fedora. He lifted it, slowly, and placed it on the table. He was older than his pictures, his face a map of disciplined lines, his white hair perfectly combed, but his eyes were young. They were a piercing, cold, Arctic blue. He laid the hat on the table. Then, just as slowly, he began to pull off his gloves. He gripped the tip of the right glove and pulled, the leather resisting with a soft, sighing sound. He balled it up, then the left. The weak fluorescent light caught the cufflink on his left wrist, the heavy silver octagon, the Gothic W. It flashed, cold as ice. "My name," he said, his voice dropping, "is Harlan Whitlow." I swallowed. My throat was sandpaper. The sound I made was tiny. But in the silence, it was a scream. Sloane Mercer made a different sound, a choked sob. Her legs gave out, and she sank into the nearest chair, her face in her hands. David Finch went pale. Not just pale. He went the color of old parchment, a sick, yellowish white. Marcus Thorne just closed his eyes. He kept them closed for a full 5 seconds. He had just run the calculation. He had just seen the iceberg, and he had just seen the name stenciled on its side. He was done. Harlan Whitlow still had not looked at me. His gaze, those terrifying blue eyes, moved from Thorne and settled on Sloane's shaking form. He did not look at her with anger. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her with the cold, bored assessment of a man who has just identified a bad line of code. "You, Miss Mercer," he said, and his voice was so quiet we all had to lean in. "Used a Caro property as leverage for your fraud. You put my daughter's name, my granddaughter's home, on your dirty paper. I just bought that house. I just bought your leverage." He turned back to Thorne. "Now, it is my turn to set the terms." Thorne opened his eyes. All the fight was gone. "What terms?" It wasn't a question. "An emergency meeting of the board of directors," Harlan said. "Not shareholders. That's too slow. Your full board. Tonight, 8 p.m., you will have them on a secure line, and you will present this." He tapped the bond sheet. "You will announce an immediate investigation into Ms. Mercer. You will announce a full, independent audit of all off-book entities, starting with Mapletide. You will fully disclose the conflict of interest." Finch, on pure reflex, stammered, The bylaws. We can't convene a board meeting that fast. It requires 48 hours. "The bylaws," Harlan cut him off, his voice like a razor, "allow for a waiver of notice if the chairman declares an existential crisis. This," he tapped the paper again, "is an existential crisis, and you will convene them, because if you don't—" He didn't need to finish. Thorne understood. If Thorne refused, Harlan Whitlow would walk out of this room and make 2 calls, one to the Securities and Exchange Commission, informing them of a massive, undisclosed liability, the second to the Wall Street Journal. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, RD Crest stock wouldn't just be down, it would be halted by noon. The lobby would be filled with federal agents carrying briefcases. This meeting wasn't a negotiation. It was Thorne's only chance to get ahead of the story, to frame it as a self-correction rather than a catastrophic corporate failure. It was the choice between surgery and a firing squad. Thorne looked at me. He saw the pincer, the internal data, the public broadcast, the analyst who had sprung the trap. Then he looked at Harlan, the external execution, the titan who held the bonds, the house, and the company's future in his gloved hand. He nodded once, a short, sharp, defeated movement. 8 o'clock. His voice was a rasp. "We'll be ready." Harlan Whitlow nodded. He picked up his gloves. He put them on, smoothing the leather over his fingers. He settled the fedora back on his head, pulling it low. He closed his empty portfolio. He turned and walked to the door, leaving the bond sheet on the table. a time bomb ticking in the center of the room. He opened the door, paused, and walked out, never once acknowledging I was even alive. At 8:30 p.m., the Catalyst was no longer a conference room, it was a courtroom. The mood was funereal, the air scrubbed cold by the overpowered ventilation system. I was at the end of the long marble table. David Finch and Sloan Mercer were huddled together halfway down, a physical alliance of shared guilt. Marcus Thorne, the chairman, sat alone at the head, looking pale and 10 years older. The glass walls, which by day offered a view of power, now reflected only the room's stark interior against the blackness of the night sky. The real judges were on the massive 12K screen, the 9 other members of the board of directors, dialed in from Chicago, London, Hong Kong, and Tokyo, 9 faces in 9 perfect squares, a digital jury. Harlan Whitlow was not present, but his name, his threat, hung in the air like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. A dry, disembodied voice from the center speaker, the lead director in Chicago, started the proceedings. "This emergency meeting of the board is called to order. Mr. Thorne, you have declared an existential crisis. The floor is yours." Thorne stood slowly. "Thank you. We have identified a significant financial irregularity concerning an off-book entity, Mapletide Investments. This irregularity appears to be linked to a series of unauthorized actions by the COO, Ms. Mercer." Sloan made a strangled sound, but Thorne didn't look at her. He was already throwing her to the wolves to save himself. "We also have a material witness who uncovered the discrepancy," Thorne continued, his voice flat. "Ms. Lena Caro, from our risk analysis department." He gestured to me. "Ms. Caro, please present your findings." This was my stage. I stood. I plugged my encrypted drive into the port. My hands were perfectly steady. The adrenaline had burned away, leaving a core of ice. "Members of the board," I said, my voice carrying in the quiet room. The 9 faces watched me. "My findings are not a slide deck. They are a timeline." The screen lit up, not with charts, but with a simple, brutal data flow diagram. It was a map of the crime. At 09:14 on September 18th, I began, my laser pointer landing on the first node. A wire transfer of $12 million was authorized from Ardent Crest's operating account to a new entity, Mapletide Investments. The authorization code was 401B. This is a Level 1 executive override, requiring COO approval. Ms. Mercer authorized it. I clicked. The transaction was routed from a terminal with the internal IP address 10.39.1.4. That IP address is hardwired to the executive suite on this floor. I clicked again. A series of similar transfers followed, totaling $32 million. Concurrently, a debt-holding entity, also managed by Ardent Crest, initiated a foreclosure on a private property, 11 Sparrow Lane. The asset was rushed to auction. I pointed to a timestamp. At 14:02, the day before the auction, Ms. Mercer's encrypted VPN, the same IP address, 1039.1.4, logged into the auction house's private bidding portal to register a shell company. This shell company was intended to be the sole bidder. I traced the final line on the diagram. The intent, as shown in recovered emails, was to purchase the asset at a sub-market price, then have the auction house wire the surplus from the sale directly to Mapletide. It was a closed loop, a mechanism to launder $32 million of corporate funds, disguised as a mortgage liquidation. I finished. The silence was absolute. The 9 faces on the screen were grim. Sloan was shaking. She knew she was done, but like any cornered animal, she had one move left, to attack. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping. "This is a farce. You can't listen to her. This is a personal attack." Thorne tried to silence her. "Sloan, sit down." "No!" she shrieked, pointing at me, her finger trembling. "You need to know who she is. Look at her. Her name is Lena Caro, but her mother was Eleanor Whitlow. She is Harlan Whitlow's granddaughter." The air was sucked from the room. The 9 faces on the screen, which had been impassive, now registered open shock. They leaned closer. Sloane pressed her advantage, her voice rising. "This is a setup, a coordinated, familial attack. Harlan Whitlow wants this company. He always has. He bought the house at the auction just to create this leverage. This isn't an audit. It's a vendetta. It's a hostile takeover disguised as compliance. This entire presentation is inadmissible. It's a conflict of interest." She was good. She had planted the one seed of doubt that could save them, that this was just one titan attacking another, with me as the proxy soldier. I let the accusation hang in the air. I waited until all 9 faces had turned from her, back to me. I did not raise my voice. "She is correct," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "Harlan Whitlow is my maternal grandfather." Sloane almost smiled. Finch looked relieved. "I have not spoken to him in 10 years, I continued, my voice flat and cold. "Not since he refused to pay for my mother's medical care. My name is Lena Caro, the name I have legally used since I was 12 years old. If you check my HR file, which is attached to my report, you will see I was hired on merit. I declared no family relationship to any industry figures. Your own recruitment team," I locked eyes with Sloane, "confirm this." I let that sink in. I was clean. "Ms. Mercer is right about one thing," I said. "There is a conflict of interest here, but it is not mine." I clicked my remote. The data flow diagram vanished. A single email filled the 12K screen. From Ardent Crest, Internal Controls, to Lena Caro. Subject, Urgent Risk Assessment. "We have reviewed the data, found to be in full compliance with corporate policy. No findings are warranted at this time." "This," I said, "is the official response I received from the Internal Controls Department 2 days ago, when I submitted this exact report through official channels, an audit department that, per our corporate charter, reports directly to the Chief Operating Officer. The no findings email was authorized." I zoomed in on the digital signature. "By Director Allen, a man Ms. Mercer promoted 3 months ago." The board members stared. The pincer had snapped shut. I wasn't an avenging granddaughter. I was an analyst who had followed procedure, and Sloane had been caught, in writing, burying the evidence. "This is," the lead director began, his voice gravelly, "this is indefensible." "It gets worse," a new voice said. The main door to the catalyst hissed open. It was Harlan's lawyer, the man who had called Thorne. "Mr. Gray." He was flanked by Tara Singh, the severe assistant, who was pushing a media cart. "This board meeting is in closed session," Finch stammered, standing. "You are trespassing." "I am here as counsel for Ashmere Trust 27, Gray said, his voice as cold as the room. "We are now a material party to this fraud. We were forced to overpay for an asset due to Ms. Mercer's market manipulation. As such, we have conducted our own discovery, and we found this." Tara Singh plugged a laptop into the media cart. My evidence vanished, replaced by a new document. "This," Gray said, "is a private kickback agreement between Mapletide Investments and Mr. Charles Pike of Alder and Pike Auctioneers." My God, Harlan had been busy. "It stipulates," Gray continued, "that for any properties steered to the auction by Ms. Mercer, Mr. Pike would receive a 10% processing fee and would then wire 50% of the net surplus, the exact term from my client's evidence, to a third-party account, not Mapletide, a private, offshore account." Sloane was finished, but Harlan wasn't aiming for Sloane, not anymore. "The contract is signed by Ms. Mercer," Gray said, "but we are more interested in Addendum B." He zoomed in, a new page, a single paragraph. "This addendum authorizes a strategic consulting fee of $500,000 to be paid to the same offshore account for services related to risk mitigation. It is not signed by Ms. Mercer." He zoomed in on the signature at the bottom of the page. It was bold, confident, and utterly damning. Marcus Thorne. Thorne went white, a bone white, translucent shade. He looked at the signature, his signature, and he didn't breathe. He wasn't just negligent. He wasn't just covering for Sloan. He was a direct, compensated partner in the fraud. "This," the lead director on the screen whispered, his face ashen. "This is a criminal conspiracy." A new window popped up on the screen, a new face joining the grid. Harlan Whitlow. He was in a dark study, a single lamp illuminating his face. He looked at none of us. He looked directly into the camera, addressing the 9 board members. "Gentlemen," he said. His voice was quiet, but it had the weight of a collapsing building. "You have a $32 million undisclosed liability. You have a COO who has committed wire fraud. You have a chairman taking kickbacks from a criminal enterprise. You have an analyst," he didn't look at me, but he said the word, "who has just given you an irrefutable audit trail." He leaned closer. "You will either fix this yourselves, right now, or the market will fix it for you at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. The choice is yours." The line went dead. His square on the grid vanished. The silence that followed was absolute. The lead director in Chicago broke it. His voice was iron. "We will vote. Motion to immediately suspend Chief Operating Officer Sloan Mercer, pending criminal investigation. All in favor." One by one, the squares lit up. Aye. 9 ayes. Motion to form a special committee for an immediate, independent, external audit of all executive accounts and off-book entities. All in favor. Aye. Motion to immediately place Chairman Marcus Thorne on administrative leave, to revoke all executive authority, and to place him under formal investigation by the special committee. All in favor. Aye. It was a bloodbath. It took less than 60 seconds. The entire 39th floor had just been decapitated. Thorne sat in his chair, his hands flat on the marble. A ruined man. Sloan just stood there, hollowed out, her mouth open. The lead director looked at me. "Ms. Caro, the board, thanks you for your extraordinary diligence. Do you have anything further?" I stood. I gathered my things. I looked not at the board, but at Sloan. "Yes, just one final point of data." My voice was clear and cold. "The asset used to initiate this fraud, the house at 11 Sparrow Lane, it is no longer collateral for a mistake. As of 3:00 p.m. today, it belongs to the Ashmere Trust." I paused. "It's off your books, for good." The internal gavel had fallen. I walked out of the room, not looking back. As I passed the glass wall, I saw Sloane's reflection. She was just standing there, a ghost in her own office, staring at the black glass. Her face, reflected against the pinpricks of the city lights, looked like it was cracking, splintering into 1,000 pieces. The board members on the screen were a silent, 9-boxed jury. Sloan was a statue of shattered glass. Marcus Thorne, his face the color of old paper, stared at his own signature, the signature that had just ended his career. David Finch was frantically, silently texting, probably to his own lawyers. The screen with Harlan Whitlow's face lit up again. He hadn't left. He was watching, waiting. He addressed the lead director in Chicago. "The votes are recorded," Harlan said. "The 39th floor is clean. Now, we deal with the trash." He was talking about Mapletide, the $32 million hole. "This entity," Harlan continued, "is now a toxic asset. It's a magnet for the SEC, for the IRS, for every federal prosecutor who wants to make a name. If it stays on your books, even as under investigation, it will poison your stock for a decade. It will invite class action lawsuits that will bankrupt you." The lead director's face was grim. "What do you propose, Mr. Whitlow?" "I propose a clean cut," Harlan said. "My lawyers have drafted an acquisition agreement. I will buy Mapletide Investments and all its associated liabilities from Ardent Crest." Thorne actually let out a short, hysterical laugh. "Buy it? You'll need more than $32 million. The liabilities." "I will buy it," Harlan said, his voice flat. For $1. Silence. This wasn't a purchase. It was an execution. He was offering to take the bomb off their hands. He was offering to be the one to walk it into the SEC, to hand them the case on a silver platter. He was taking control of the narrative and the evidence. The lead director understood instantly. A $1 transfer. In exchange for what? Harlan? You don't do favors. In exchange, Harlan said, for 2 conditions. First, I hand over the evidence to the commission, not you. I control the investigation. It will be clean, and it will be absolute. He paused. Second, restitution. You have a $32 million hole in your books. You just saved that money by transferring the liability to me. You will now take that same $32 million from your corporate reserves, and you will establish a restitution fund. Not for the SEC, for the shareholders you defrauded. One of the board members, a woman from Hong Kong, unmuted. Which shareholders? The institutional investors? No, Harlan said, his eyes cold. The institutions have their own lawyers. I'm talking about the small ones, the 401ks, the retail investors who believed your press releases, and specifically, he slid a document into view of his camera. You will start by making the Ashmere Teachers Pension Fund whole. Their losses on your stock in the last quarter total $4.8 million. They were the ones who really paid for Ms. Mercer's penthouse. It was a masterstroke. He wasn't just a corporate raider. He was a populist hero. He had just made it politically impossible for the board to refuse. He was using their own money to pay back the people they had stolen from, and he was taking the credit. The lead director nodded. The board agrees in principle. We'll have counsel review the... There's one more thing, I said. All eyes, in the room and on the screen, turned to me. Sloane, who had been rocking slightly, froze. This meeting, I said, this vote, this restitution, it's all meaningless unless it's communicated. The compliance team saw Ms. Mercer confess. The rest of the company just thinks the 39th floor is in a long meeting. I pulled a single document from my portfolio. It was the Priority 1 Alert authorization form I'd used that morning. This company, I said, is not a black box. Its employees are not mushrooms. They have a right to know what was done in their name. I placed the paper on the table and hit the execute command on my laptop. This authorization allows me to use the emergency broadcast system, not just for the compliance team, but company-wide. On the wall behind Thorne, a small red light on the ceiling camera blinked on. We were live. To every desktop in the building, to every remote employee logged into the network. Sloane saw the red light. She finally, completely broke. No, she screamed, lunging across the table. You can't. This is a smear campaign. This is libel. It's a kangaroo court. You're smearing me. She was scrambling for my laptop, but David Finch, in a moment of pure self-preservation, grabbed her arm. Sloane, stop! Don't touch her! She's right, I said calmly, as Sloane fought against his grip. It would be a smear campaign if it weren't explicitly authorized by the corporate charter. I looked directly into the ceiling camera. For all employees watching, I refer you to Article 9, Section 4 of the Ardent Crest Bylaws. In the event of catastrophic moral or financial failure, the board reserves the right to authorize full and immediate internal disclosure to prevent systemic collapse and restore faith in the institution. The lead director. I nodded to his square on the screen. Invoke that clause 10 minutes ago. This is not a smear. This is a decontamination. I turned back to Sloane. She had stopped fighting, her chest heaving. And transparency, I said, must be total. The $32 million that Mr. Whitlow just mentioned wasn't just numbers in a shell company, it was tangible. I held up a new sheet of paper, the one from Mr. Gray. This is a list of the personal assets Ms. Mercer and Mr. Thorne acquired in the last 6 months, held in proxies to avoid detection. Thorne closed his eyes. Sloane went rigid. I read from the list, my voice clear and cold, a death knell in the quiet room. broadcast to 3,000 employees. 1 Penthouse 4B at the Ashmere Spire, purchased by Sloan Mercer Trust, an entity whose sole trustee is her father-in-law, Richard Caro. 2. A 2025 Bentley Continental, leased through Mapletide Investments and listed as a corporate consulting expense. 3. A wire transfer of $1.2 million from Mapletide to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under the name Mercer Thorne Holdings, LLC. Sloan let out a low, guttural wail. She turned to the door. "Security! Security! Get in here! Get her out! She's... Security! Security! Get in here!" The door to the catalyst hissed open. 2 uniformed security guards stepped in. They were the 2 senior officers, men I'd seen for years. They looked at Sloan, screaming. They looked at Thorne, a living corpse in his chair. They looked at the board, watching silently from the screen. Then they looked at me, and they didn't move. "They can't help you, Sloan," I said. Mr. Gray, who had been silent by the door, stepped forward. He held up a file. "The guards," he announced to the room, "and the head of building security have already been served with a temporary restraining order, signed by Judge Alito an hour ago. It bars you, Ms. Mercer, from approaching, contacting, or intimidating Ms. Lina Caro, who is now a protected federal whistleblower. Checkmate. The guards weren't here to arrest me. They were here to protect me from her." Sloan Mercer looked at the guards. She looked at me, and she collapsed into her chair, a hollowed-out ruin. The lead director's voice was like stone. "Marcus, you have one final act to perform as chairman. You will sign Mr. Whitlow's transfer agreement. You will sign the restitution pact. You will sign the company-wide transparency pledge. You will do this to mitigate the damage you have caused, and as a final, single act of good faith. Do you understand?" Marcus Thorne did not speak. He picked up the pen Mr. Gray had placed on the table. He pulled the 3 documents toward him. His hand was shaking, but he signed. His bold, confident signature was now a spidery, broken scrawl. He signed away Mapletide. He signed away $32 million. He signed away his entire legacy. On the screen, Harlan Whitlow's square went dark. The meeting was over. Mr. Gray collected the signed documents. Tara Singh collected the media cart. They packed up with cold, silent efficiency. Gray looked at me, a quick, sharp nod. It wasn't warmth. It was professional acknowledgement, an analyst to a lawyer. The work was done. Then they left. The board members vanished, one by one, their video feeds winking out, until the screen was black. The 2 guards stepped back, one on either side of the door, their arms crossed. The room was silent. It was just me, the 2 guards, and the wreckage, Thorne, staring at his hands, Finch, already on the phone with his own counsel, and Sloan, who was just gone. She was a shell, staring at the black glass, at her own faint reflection. I packed my laptop. I put my encrypted drive in my pocket. I walked out of the catalyst, the guard's eyes following me. The executive suite was dark and empty. The whole 39th floor felt like a tomb. I walked to the elevator bank. He was there. Harlan Whitlow. He was standing alone, his back to me, waiting for the elevator. He wasn't in his auction disguise. He was just an old man in an impeccable, dark gray suit. The light from above caught the silver W on his cufflink. He had heard me approach, but he didn't turn. I stopped a few feet behind him. The silence was thick, heavier than anything in the conference room. All the adrenaline, the ice, the rage. It was all gone. I just felt tired. He had paused, his hand halfway to the call button. He was waiting. My voice was a whisper, so quiet I wasn't even sure I'd said it. "Thank you for raising the paddle." He didn't move. His back was still to me. I could see the rigid line of his shoulders under the expensive wool. He let the silence stretch for a beat. Then his voice came, a low rasp, not meant for anyone else in the world. "You were the one who brought down the gavel." The elevator chimed, The door slid open with a soft, expensive sigh. He stepped in. The doors slid shut, leaving me alone in the hallway, his words echoing in the empty, silent air. I didn't go back to my apartment. I didn't go to the office. The next day, after hours of staring at my ceiling, I took a cab to the one place that felt like the center of the storm. I arrived at 11 Sparrow Lane in the late afternoon. The sky was a bruised, watery purple. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling, the small yard overgrown. A white van was parked at the curb. A man in a blue work shirt was sitting on the porch steps, drinking from a thermos. He stood up as I approached. "You the rep for Ashmere Trust?" he asked. I nodded, my throat tight. "I'm Lena." "Got it," he said. He wasn't a talker. The order just said, "Ashmere Trust 27, open, rekey, and wait. You're the first one here." He turned and got to work. He was a professional. The sound of his tools, a click, a metallic scrape, a sharp thwack, was precise, clean. It took him less than 30 seconds. The front door, the one my mother had painted a bright, hopeful blue, clicked open. "All yours," he said, handing me a new set of keys, bright and sharp. "I already billed the trust." He packed his tools and left. I was alone. I put my hand on the doorknob. It was cold. I pushed the door open. It swung inward with a low, long creak, a sound that vibrated straight into my bones. The house was empty. Sloan and Richard had taken all the furniture, all the life. All that was left was the smell. It was the smell of old wood, the faint, sweet scent of my mother's lavender polish, and something else. Something clean and astringent. New paint. I saw a gallon can of white primer in the corner of the entryway. The auction house, or maybe Harlan, had already had the walls patched, the most obvious damage erased, sanitized. Sunlight, thick and gold from the late afternoon, slanted through the dusty front window, cutting a perfect bright rectangle on the bare wooden floor. Dust motes danced in the beam, tiny, silent constellations. I walked into the kitchen. The linoleum, yellowed and cracked, was the same. The knot in the wood that looked like a running dog was still there. And on the center of the counter, the only object in the entire house, was a box. It wasn't a cardboard box. It was a heavy, dark wooden case, polished like a violin. It looked ancient, and burned into the center of the lid, deep and dark, was the familiar Gothic W. My hand was shaking. I opened it. The inside was lined with dark green velvet. There were two things. One was a key, not the bright, sharp one the locksmith had given me. This was an old, heavy, ornate skeleton key, the original key to the front door, the one my mother used to keep on a hook by the stove. The other was a single, folded sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery, his stationery. I unfolded it. The words were not typed. They were written in a sharp, dense, black script, his handwriting. Lena. It was the first time I had ever seen my name in his hand. I am not a man for apologies. They are revisions, and I prefer to get things right the first time. I will not apologize for my silence. It was a tool. Your mother was a fine woman. She was soft, and she was kind. I loved her for it, and I feared for her because of it. The world, as you have now seen, is not soft or kind. It is run by hungry people. When she married your father, I saw weakness. When she married Richard Caro, I saw a fatal vulnerability. I could not protect her from her own heart. My distance was my only option. But you are not her. You are her daughter. But you are also my granddaughter. You have her heart. But you have my spine. I saw it when you applied for college. When you refused to use my name. I saw it when you took the job at Ardent Crest, a stupid, arrogant company. But you went in through the front door, not the back. I chose to remain silent because I wanted you to find the value of your own voice. I could have crushed Sloan Mercer with one phone call. It would have been a financial transaction. It would have taught you nothing. It would have made you a beneficiary. It would not have made you strong. When you spoke, Lena, they went silent. You must remember that. When you speak with the truth, when you have done the work, you own the room. They went silent because you had the data, and you were not afraid. I had to pause. My eyes were burning. I swiped at them angrily. I read on. The auction was a trap. I have been tracking Mapletide for 6 months, ever since Thorne was stupid enough to try and raise capital from one of my minority partners. I saw the rot. I saw Sloane's name, and I saw her link to Richard Caro. When I saw the 11 Sparrow Lane lien, I knew what she was doing. She was arrogant. She was sloppy. She was using her own stepdaughter's past to launder her theft. She believed she was the predator. She didn't realize she was the bait. I set the stage. I knew her greed. I knew she would rig the auction. All I had to do was show up and outbid her. My presence, my winning bid, would panic her. It would force her to accelerate her fraud. To get the money out, it would force her to make mistakes, and it would bring Thorne, the real target, out of the shadows. I set the trap, but I needed someone on the inside to spring it. You did not disappoint. My hands were shaking, the heavy paper rattling in the silent kitchen. He hadn't just been watching, he had been orchestrating. I read the last paragraph. The house is yours. The Ashmere Trust will be dissolved and the title transferred to you, free and clear. Should you want it, it is your mother's legacy. Bought back with your work, you earned it. But I will offer you a piece of advice. A house is just a box of wood and memories. It can be an anchor, or it can be a foundation. You decide. If you do not want it, tell Tara. We will sell it, and we will use the proceeds to start a fund for the other people, the teachers, the employees, the families, who have had their homes stolen by dirty decisions and dirtier men. The choice is yours, as it should have been from the beginning. H.O. I folded the letter. I put it in my pocket. I looked around the empty kitchen. The silence was immense. I could hear the house breathing. I could hear the thwack of the gavel. I could hear my mother laughing. A faint, high sound, like wind chimes. I walked out of the kitchen, down the short hall to the back wall. It was still there. The new paint, the primer, had been carefully applied around it. A small, 5-inch square patch of the old, faded wallpaper. And the pencil marks. Lena. 4 years, Lena. 6 years, Lena. 8 years. My heart. It didn't just ache. It cracked. A sharp, physical pain that made my breath catch. This was it. This was the last piece of her. The last tangible proof that we had been here. That we had been happy. Before the sickness. Before Richard. Before Sloane. Before any of it. This was my past. This was the memory. And Harlan was right. It was an anchor. It was holding me here. In this house of ghosts. In this city. In this story. I touched the pencil mark for 8 years. My fingers were steady. The pain was real. But it was no longer a fog. It was a fact. I could feel it, acknowledge it, and not be broken by it. I knew what I had to do. I walked back to the kitchen. I looked at the dark wooden box. I found a pen in my bag. I took a plain white envelope from my portfolio. I didn't write a letter. I wrote a directive. A simple, clear note, just like the one he had left for me. Sell the house, market price, all proceeds to the Sparrow Fund. I placed the note inside the box, next to the original, heavy skeleton key. I put the lid back on. I closed it. The sound of the wood settling was soft, but final, a period. I walked out of the house. I didn't use the new key to lock it. I just pulled the old, blue door shut. The latch clicked, the sound echoing in the empty rooms behind me. I stood on the porch. The sun was gone, leaving the sky a deep, bruised indigo. A cool wind was blowing in from the east, sweeping up the street. It smelled of damp earth, of coming rain, and of dry, burning leaves. It smelled, for the first time in my life, like freedom. The day after the emergency board meeting was a vacuum. The 39th floor was a ghost ship. Sloane's and Thorne's offices were dark, their doors locked. The rest of the company was paralyzed by rumors. 1,000 different, contradictory stories whispered over Slack and in break rooms. They were all wrong. They were all guessing. They needed the truth. I sat at my desk, not on the 39th floor, but at my own small workstation on the 24th. I was still, for this brief moment, just Lina Caro, analyst, and I had one more report to file. I opened a blank document. I did not address it to the board. To all employees and shareholders of Ardent Crest Holdings. From Lina Caro. Risk analysis. Subject: an open letter on recent events and our path forward. I spent 2 hours writing it. It was the most important document of my life. It was not an accusation, it was an autopsy. Colleagues, you will have heard about the abrupt leadership changes following last night's emergency board meeting. This was not a transition. It was a necessary and painful emergency procedure. This is what happened, not rumor. Fact. An internal risk assessment, which I filed, identified severe, undisclosed liabilities and conflicts of interest. The subject was a shell company, Mapletide Investments. The beneficiaries were our COO, Sloan Mercer, and our chairman, Marcus Thorne. This report was submitted through standard compliance channels. It was subsequently buried, and I was issued a no-findings report by an audit department under the direct control of the COO. This is a systemic failure. The system designed to protect us was used to conceal a crime. I was forced to escalate the findings to an external party and, ultimately, to the board of directors. The board meeting confirmed the following: wire fraud, the issuance of undisclosed bonds to conceal losses, and a criminal kickback scheme involving the chairman. The leadership you trusted used company funds as a personal slush fund, and they used their authority to cover their tracks. I paused. This was the hardest part. The part where I had to expose myself to stop the rumors. A note on conflict. It is true that Sloan Mercer is my stepmother. It is true that Harlan Whitlow, the external party who forced the board meeting, is my grandfather. This is not a family feud that spilled into a boardroom. This is a story of a corporate failure so profound that the only person who could stop it was an analyst who happened to have two unavoidable personal connections to the crime. The involvement of the Whitlow name was not an exercise of power. It was the result of a catastrophic breakdown in governance. My report was ignored. The system failed. I used the only leverage I had left. I had to set the new tone, now. Our path forward. Accountability does not end with resignations. It begins with restitution. The $32 million in misappropriated funds will be fully restored, not by Mr. Whitlow, but by Ardent Crest. This money will seed two initiatives, effective immediately. 1. The Sparrow Fund, a restitution fund to make stakeholders whole. This begins with the $4.8 million lost by the Ashmere Teachers Pension Fund. It will also be used to assist any employees or smaller partners who suffered financial damages from the Mapletide scheme. 2. A new conflict of interest protocol. Effective today. All executive-level asset transfers will require dual, independent sign-off from a new Data Integrity Committee and the board. This protocol is attached. We cannot rebuild trust by promising to be better. We must rebuild it by implementing systems that make it impossible to be this corrupt again. Sincerely, Lina Caro. I hit send. It went to all 3,000 employees, and to the investor relations wire. The gavel had fallen. My terminal chimed. A video call. It was the lead director in Chicago. His face was tired. Ms. Caro. Lina. That was an extraordinary document. It was the truth, I said. The board concurs, he said. Which brings me to the next point. We have a vacuum. We need a new chief risk officer. The job is yours. I didn't hesitate. No. He looked surprised. No? This is a significant promotion. You've earned it. I will not be the primary beneficiary of a crisis I exposed, I said, my voice flat. It's a conflict of interest. It's the very thing I just wrote about. He stared at me, then a slow smile spread across his face. You really are his granddaughter, aren't you? You don't just want to win. You want to win clean. I just want the data to be clean, I said. The system is broken. Let me fix it, but not as a C-suite executive. I made my counteroffer. I will accept one role, head of data integrity, but with conditions. First, it is interim. I have 6 months to build the new system and make it independent. Then I'm out. Second, I report directly to the board, not to the new CEO you hire. Third, my work and the new system will be subject to a full external audit, which I will not control. He nodded, the smile gone, replaced by respect. Done. Your terms are accepted. Welcome to the job. Ms. Caro, your new credentials will be active in 1 hour. The call ended. My first act as head of data integrity was to send a company-wide memo. To all staff, facilities, from Lina Caro, head of data integrity, interim. Subject, renaming of the catalyst. The conference room on the 39th floor. The catalyst has served as a symbol of insulated, non-transparent executive power. This is a new era. Effective immediately, the room will be renamed the Glass Room. Furthermore, a new policy is in effect. All meetings of the Risk Committee, the Ethics Committee, and all executive-level financial reviews held in this room will be recorded. The full, unedited transcripts and audio will be logged and made available to the internal audit team within 24 hours. No exceptions. We are, quite literally, opening the room. The fallout was immediate. The system was in shock. Sloan Mercer's resignation was formally announced an hour later. Marcus Thorne's immediate retirement for health reasons followed. The company's official press release, drafted by me and the lead director, was simple. Ardent Crest had uncovered significant irregularities and was cooperating fully with regulatory authorities. The financial papers had a field day. They had put the pieces together: the auction, the emergency meeting, the Whitlow name. The Wall Street Journal ran the definitive story the next morning. The headline was dramatic. An auction paddle, a granddaughter, and the coup that saved Ardent Crest. I read the article over my morning coffee. It was breathless. It painted me as an avenging angel. It painted Harlan as a puppet master. It painted Sloan as a villain. It was all true, and it was all wrong. It was a story, a legend, and legends are useless. Legends are exceptions. They don't prevent the next crime. They just make for a good story after the fact. I took out my personal notebook. I wrote a single line on a fresh page. Don't let this become a legend. Make it a procedure. My work wasn't done. It was just beginning. As if on cue. My personal phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number. A New York area code. I opened it. It was 3 words. Coffee tomorrow? No name. It didn't need one. It was the first time he had initiated contact with me in over a decade. The first time he had ever reached out to me as me. I looked at the text. I thought about the house. I thought about the box. I thought about the $32 million, the kickbacks, the empire he commanded. I thought about the 10 years of silence. I typed my reply. Yes, but we're not talking about money. I hit send. The corner coffee shop in Ashmere was called The Daily Grind. It was a neutral space, smelling of burned beans, wet newspaper, and the sugary scent of muffins that had been sitting under glass for too long. It was a world away from the 39th floor, from the pressurized silence of the catalyst, from the old-world leather and mahogany of Whitlow and Gray. It was precisely 8 a.m. The morning sun was low, cutting a sharp, bright blade across the cafe's worn linoleum floor. Dust motes, tiny and infinite, drifted through the light, catching fire for a second before vanishing back into the gloom. They looked like salt. He was already there. He sat in a booth by the window, not looking out. He was facing the door. He was waiting for me. There was no disguise, no fedora, no black leather gloves. The armor was gone. He was just an old man. His white hair sharp and perfect. His posture immaculate even in the cheap vinyl-backed booth. He wore a dark, simple business suit. He was reading a physical copy of the Wall Street Journal. I walked toward him. My footsteps were loud on the tile. The cafe's low murmur, a few construction workers ordering at the counter, a student typing on a laptop, didn't change. He heard me. He didn't look up, not right away. He finished the paragraph he was reading. Then, with a precise, deliberate fold, he lowered the paper and placed it beside him. His eyes met mine. They were just as I remembered them from the boardroom feed. Arctic blue, calculating. They held no warmth, but for the first time, they held no judgment. They held acknowledgement. I slid into the booth opposite him. The vinyl was cracked and cold. A waitress came over, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I get you folks?" "Coffee," he said. His voice was the same dry rasp, but quieter here. "Black." "The same," I said. She nodded and left. The silence stretched. It wasn't the agonizing, heavy silence of the boardroom. It wasn't the cold, empty silence of 11 Sparrow Lane. It was a waiting silence. The silence after a storm, when the air is still and charged. He reached down to the leather briefcase by his foot. He did not ask how I was. I did not ask about his trip. The small talk was not in our blood. He placed 2 documents on the cheap Formica tabletop, side by side. The first was a cashier's check receipt, a single, staggering number, paid to the Ashmere Teachers' Pension Fund. It was the first disbursement. The second was a closing statement. The line item read, 11 Sparrow Lane. It showed the sale, finalized this morning, at 30% over market value, and at the bottom, a second wire transfer. The entire proceeds, minus closing costs, routed to a new chartered account, the Sparrow Fund. He had closed the loop. He had kept his word. The house was gone. The money was already working. It was a final, perfect, clean transaction. He didn't say anything. He just left the papers there, his half of the ledger. I reached into my bag. I placed my own item on the table, sliding it up against his documents. It was my new employee identification card. The plastic was still stiff. The photo was terrible. The light flat and institutional, but the words underneath it were clear. Lena Caro, Head of Data Integrity, Interim. My half of the ledger. He looked at my card. He looked at his financial statements. He saw the new corporate title. He saw the word interim, and I knew he understood what it meant, that I wasn't taking power. I was cleaning the system, that I wouldn't be corrupted by the title because I had no intention of keeping it. He looked at me. Then, he extended his hand across the table. It was not the warm, soft hand of a grandfather. It was the dry, firm hand of an investor, of a man who builds and breaks empires. I took it. There was no drama, no tears, no reconciliation. It was not an embrace of forgiveness. It was a handshake, a contract, a mutual acknowledgement of a job well done. We held it for a beat, 2, 3, then let go. He leaned back, his gaze moving from my ID card to my eyes. "You don't need a house," he said, his voice low, "to have a home." I processed his words. He had understood. He had read my note. He knew I had walked away from the anchor, from the last physical piece of my mother. He was confirming I had made the right choice. I met his gaze. "And a company doesn't need secrets," I replied, "to have strength." His expression didn't change, but a flicker, a tiny shift, happened in those blue eyes. He had heard my message, my thesis. He knew I wasn't just talking about Ardent Crest. I was talking about him, his entire life's work of shadows and silence. The waitress returned, placing 2 heavy white mugs on the table. The coffee was dark and bitter. The high-pitched, metallic scream of the espresso machine's steam wand cut through the cafe, a sharp, piercing sound that ripped the quiet. It was the loudest thing in the world. It sounded, in my head, exactly like the final, definitive whack of the auctioneer's gavel. The sound died. The case was closed. He picked up his coffee. I picked up mine. We did not toast. I took a sip. It was scalding. I put the mug down. I slid my ID card off the table and back into my wallet. He folded his documents and put them back in his briefcase. The transaction was complete. The meeting was over. I stood up. He looked up at me. Lena. It was the first time he had used my name in person since I was 8 years old. I waited. Your work, he said. It's clean. From him, it was the highest possible compliment. It was, perhaps, the only version of I love you he knew how to say. It's not done, I said. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him with his newspaper and his black coffee. The bell on the door chimed, a small, tinny sound. The Ashmere air was cold and sharp. I pulled my coat tight. I had to get to the office. Work was waiting. The glass room had my name on it, and there were new glass walls to inspect, to make sure no one was building new secrets in the shadows. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, like the video, and give us a major boost by hitting that hype button. It helps get this story heard by so many more people.